Welcome to this Wildcard report builder tutorial. In this video we'll talk about how to use query parameters and filters. We'll start with a quick description of the difference between report parameters and query parameters and why it's worthwhile learning query parameters in the first place. We'll then explain how to create a parameter in the query designer and show how report parameters and query parameters are linked. We'll explain how you can change parameter properties such as data types and the parameter name, and then show how to work with date parameters and text parameters, including how to use wildcards. At the end of the video we'll explain how you can display parameter values in the report so your end user can see them in exported versions of the report, and also how to display a no rows message when the values you enter into the parameter don't return any results. So let's get started. The aim of this video is to show you how to create query parameters to allow your end user to filter the results of your report. So once I've filled in the values to the 4 parameters I've created here in this example, I can click the View Report button to see a list of films which match the criteria I've entered. If you're looking at this and thinking it looks very similar to what we did in the previous video on report parameters, you'd be right actually. Yes, the end result is pretty similar, and what the user does is pretty similar as well. Here's the report parameters example. I've filled in pretty much the same values, making sure to use the correct wildcards. And then when I hit the View Report button, I once again see that same list of results. There is quite a significant difference though in what happens in the background. With a report parameter, the entire table of data is loaded into the report first, and then we subsequently filter those results once the data has reached the report. With query parameters, we send the values of the parameters back to SQL Server, and the filtering is done at that side so that only the data required for the report is sent to it. So you can notice a fairly significant difference in performance by using query parameters. It does require a bit more effort to learn how to use query parameters. You need to know a bit more SQL, but that's what we'll aim to teach you in this video. If you'd like to follow along, you'll need to make sure you've got a copy of the Wildcard movies database, and if you don't already have that set up, then you can use this video to help you get it configured. Assuming you have done that, I've got a brand new blank report waiting for me in Report Builder, and the first thing I'll do in here is create a data source which connects to that database. So I can right click on my data sources folder and choose Add Data Source. I'll call this Movies, as I usually do, use an embedded connection pointing to a Microsoft SQL Server, and then I can click the Build button to build the connection string. I'll type in a shortcut to my local host, // and then the name of my instance of SQL or SQL Server, which is SQL 2017. I can then select my movies database from the drop-down list and then click OK, and click OK again to create my data source. I'll create a quick basic data set as well by right-clicking on the data source and choosing Add Dataset. I'll call this one Films, and then use the query designer so that I can pick from a list of tables, and from the film table I'll include the title, the release date and the runtime minutes. I'll click OK, and then once the query's been generated, click OK again, and finally I'll display a basic table to show the results of that dataset. So I'm going to get rid of the report footer first of all, the page footer, by right clicking and choosing Remove Page Footer. Then I can get rid of this title text box at the top. I'll replace that with a simple table, and then aim to show the title, the release date and the runtime minutes fields. I'll just change the column width of the title column to make sure I can see more of the film titles. And then just to make sure that I don't encounter the font rendering bug where often the text of your table isn't displayed properly, I'm going to select all the cells in the table and then switch away from the default font to any other and then back to the default font. I'll do some very basic formatting for the column headers, and then also format the release date so it looks a little more presentable. And then once I've done all of that, run the report just to check that it looks sensible. And there we go, ready to start adding our parameters. Next, I'd like to add a parameter which allows the user to filter the results based on the runtime minutes column. So I'd like the user to be able to enter the maximum runtime of a film they'd like to see, and only films up to that runtime get displayed. To do that, I'm going to go back to the design view, and I'm going to display the parameters panel, which if you haven't already got that displayed, you can display in a couple of ways. From the View tab in the ribbon, you can check the box for parameters. Alternatively, you can right click just off the body of the report and choose View Parameters from there as well. I'm not actually going to use the parameters panel to create my parameter. We're going to do this by going back to the query designer. A fairly quick and easy convenient way to create a query parameter in Report Builder is to right-click on your dataset and choose to open the Query Designer. And then we can apply a filter to the dataset we've already created. So I'm going to click the Add Filter button. I'm going to apply this to the runtime minutes field, and I'm going to change the operator so that it says is less than or equal to. But then rather than typing in a value here, I'm going to tick the box for parameter. Having done that, just watch what happens in the parameters panel. If I click OK, you'll see that it's automatically generated a report parameter with the appropriate name. Let's just have a quick look at what Report Builder has done for us. You can see that it's generated a parameter in the parameters panel, but also in the parameters folder of the report data window. If we want to see what the properties of that parameter are, you can either right-click on the parameter and choose to view its properties, or just double-click on the parameter in either the panel or the folder. You can see that it's created a parameter whose name is the same as the field we've applied our filter to. It's generated a basic prompt, which we may consider changing there. Let's change that so it's a little more descriptive. Enter the max runtime. You can see that it's selected the correct data type based on the field we've applied our filter to, so the runtime minutes field is an integer. Having just changed the prompt, I'm going to click OK. Now that report parameter, we could have created that manually, and we saw how to do that in the previous video in the series. What we would then have had to do is right-click on the film's dataset and apply a filter to it, which references the value of that parameter. But we don't need to do that in this case. If I right-click on the dataset films and choose to view its properties, you can see that Report Builder has automatically added a where clause to our query, whose runtime minutes field is compared against the value of a parameter. So the parameter name is written into the actual SQL query at runtime minutes. Now that query parameter has to be tied in some way to the report parameter. And if we have a look on the parameters panel there, the parameters page of the dialog box, you can see that this is how the two different parameters are tied together. The column on the left-hand side indicates the name of the query parameter, the one that's written into the SQL select statement. The parameter name on the right-hand side is the name of the report parameter to which that is tied. So when the query runs, the value of our runtime minutes report parameter is passed into the query parameter with the same name to return the relevant results. You don't really need to worry about that too much. If you've created your parameter in the Query Designer, then all of this happens for you automatically, and you shouldn't really want to change it at this point. Let's just check if this works. If we run the report, we can enter a value into the runtime box, enter the max runtime, click View Report, and we should see that the results returned indeed do match the value we've requested. So we've seen that when you create a parameter in the Query Designer, it creates a query parameter in the SQL code and a corresponding report parameter with the same name, and ties the two together in the Dataset Properties dialog box. What if you did want to change the name of one of those two parameters, the query parameter or the report parameter? Back in the design view, if you look at the parameter name, runtime minutes, it's just assigned the same name as the field on which the filter was based. That's not particularly meaningful. Let's say we wanted to change the report parameter so that it was called max runtime or maximum runtime. To do that, we can double click on either the parameter in the parameters panel or in the report data window, and then we can modify the parameter name using the name box. I can call this max runtime. Having done that, I can click OK. But that makes my report fall over when I try to run it. If I do try to run the report now, it gives me an error. And if I click the Details button, it tells me that there's a problem, that it's trying to refer to a non-existing report parameter called runtime minutes. So back in the design view of our report, if I look at the Dataset Properties dialog box and head on to the Parameters page, we can see that we're still trying to reference a parameter called at runtime minutes, which now no longer exists. We've changed it to max runtime. That's not a difficult problem to solve. We can happily just go to this drop-down list and select the new parameter name that we've created, and then click OK, and then run the report, and then everything will work again. But now I've got two parameters tied together with different names, and I'd prefer my parameters to have their names matching. I think it makes designing the rest of the report a little easier. So back into the design view, if I wanted my parameter names to match, I'd then need to go to the films dataset and choose to view its properties. And then I can modify the parameter name in the underlying SQL code. So I want this to say the exact same thing at max runtime. So that's what it should look like. Now that I've done that, if I click OK and run the report again, I'll find that everything still works. But now my parameter names are matched together, and I can see that again back in the dataset properties dialog box on the parameters page, max runtime and max runtime. If you wanted to avoid having to rename your parameter after you've created it, you can write your parameter names directly into the underlying SQL select statement. Let's say we wanted to create a parameter which shows all the films released on or after a certain date. To do that, I can right-click on my films dataset and choose dataset properties. And then at the end of the select statement, at the end of the where clause, I can hit enter to give myself a new line, type in a couple of spaces, and then add an AND operator to add on another criterion. This time I want to reference the film release date field. Rather than typing that out myself manually, I can just copy and paste that from the select list. And then I want to check if that is greater than or equal to the name of my new parameter. So I'll call this one start date. I need to type in an @ symbol first, and then refer to a new parameter name, which I've just made up, at start date. Once I've done that, if I click OK, you can see that that parameter immediately appears in the parameters panel and also in the parameters folder. There are a couple of things I'd like to change about this parameter, but before I do, I'd like to show that it does basically work. If I run the report, I can type in a maximum runtime, let's go for 150, and I can type in a start date, let's go for 1st of the 1st, 2016. I'll try to spell that correctly, there we go, 1/1/2016. So when I click the View Report button, I get a list of films released since the 1st of January 2016 with a maximum runtime of 150 minutes, so that works. You'll notice that I had to type in my date here. I didn't get my nice calendar control that you may remember from the previous video. But that's okay, I can still type in various dates. I can type in dates in a variety of formats and they'll be interpreted correctly. Up to a point though. Let's try to type in 1st of December 2016. So that's interpreted correctly. That's showing me all the films released since the 1st of December 2016. If I try to type this in my standard UK format, however, things don't work in quite the same way. I want to show all the films released since the 1st of December 2016. If I enter that, I return far more films than I'd expect. And that's because this is being interpreted as as January 12th, 2016, rather than 1st of December 2016. It's been interpreted in the US date format, month, day, year. That gets even worse if I wanted to find things as I might expect in the UK, to type in the 13th of the 12th, 2016, 13th of December. That's not interpreted at all. That's an invalid date entirely. So I can see that I get that error message about the date time not being able to be interpreted. So this is not a particularly nice way to use this basic parameter. When you type in the parameter name in your underlying SQL query, unlike with the one we created in the query designer, which picked its data type correctly, the start date parameter is just a string. So what we need to do back in the design view is we want to change this into a date parameter. So I can double click on the start date parameter, change its data type to a date time, and then I'll also change the caption to say, or the prompt to say, pick start date. Click OK. You'll see the calendar control appears automatically. I can now run the report. So I can pick a date from my calendar if I like, or I can type in dates in an appropriate format for my regional settings. I can choose, let's say 13/12/2016, for example. And when I run the report, it returns the correct results. Let's add another parameter which allows the user to select an end date. If I go back to the design view, we've seen two techniques now to add a query parameter. We can either use the query designer, or we can type our parameter directly into the where clause of our select statement. If you preferred the query designer method, which I admit is a little easier, unfortunately we can't use that technique any longer. Because we've manually edited our query, we can't use the query designer. If you attempt to right-click on the films dataset and choose query, you'll be told that we can't actually open it up any longer. I'm going to click no. If I click yes, it's going to abandon the changes I've made manually, so I'll click no and then close down the query designer. I could actually edit the text of my query here, in fact. So tell you what, while we're here, why don't we modify our query so that we're using the between operator. So rather than saying greater than or equal to at start date, I'm going to say between at start date and at end date. Now that I've done that, I can click OK, and I'll see a third parameter eventually appears. It's called end date. I'll see that in the dataset properties dialog box, just again to reiterate this, back in the parameters page, I've got a query parameter called at end date and an automatically generated report parameter called at end date as well. I want to make sure that the end date parameter has the correct data type. It's currently just a text parameter. It's kind of interesting to think about what's happening here with the end date parameter is text, just like the start date parameter was text initially. So the value that you enter into these parameters get passed into the query parameter as text, and that entire string, which is essentially a dynamic SQL statement, gets interpreted back at the server. Anyway, we know that we want to make sure that this is a date parameter to avoid potential typing mistakes and confusion between different date formats. So let's double click the end date parameter, set it to a date time, and then we can say pick end date rather than just end date for the prompt. We can then click OK. I'd like to rearrange my parameters a little just by clicking and dragging them in this panel. And I'd like to have a new row at the bottom of this grid so that I can add the end date below. I'll then just delete the extra columns that I've got in this grid at the top. No need to have those there. So I can right click and choose to delete those columns. And then when I run the report, I can type in a maximum runtime. I can pick a start date. Let's go for, I know, 1st of the 1st, 2000 rather than 200. Don't think many films were released around about then. And then let's go for 31/12/2010. And then when I view the report, everything is working as intended. For the final parameter, I'd like the user to be able to enter a film title, including wildcard characters, so that we could say find films that contain a certain piece of text or start with or end with. So to make that work, I need to head back to the design view, and I'm going to right click on the films dataset and choose dataset properties. At the end of my where clause in the select statement, I can give myself a new line and then a couple of spaces and another and operator. I then want to look at the film.title column. I could have copied and pasted that, of course, but I typed it in. And then to make sure that I can use wildcard characters, I'm going to use the like operator. I can then make up a new parameter name. I'll call it title text or at title text so that the new criterion looks like so. Having done that, I can click OK, and I can see that my new parameter has been created. I don't need to change its type. It's a text parameter. That's what we wanted, but I would like to modify the prompt. So I'm going to double click to open up the properties dialog box, and I'll say enter title text, and then in some round brackets, percentage as wildcard. If you watched the previous video, you'll remember we used asterisk symbols for the wildcard character, and that was because we were using the parameter's value in a filter in the reports builder application, so that uses the Visual Basic language. The parameter values we're using here, as we've mentioned, get passed back to SQL Server. So it's important that SQL Server can interpret the wildcard character, which means it needs to be a percentage symbol. I can click OK, and then I can run the report. And then if I enter some simple values, I'll go for 150 for the maximum runtime, 1st of the 1st, 1990 for the start date, 31st of the 12th, 2010 for the end date, and for the title text, I'll type in a percentage symbol with the word star and then another percentage symbol. And when I click the View Report button, I'll return a list of films matching that set of criteria. When we set up our text parameters using the like operator in the way we've done so here, we do have quite a lot of flexibility in terms of what search strings we can type in. So of course we can change the text we're looking for. I'll change the word star to the word king, and that will find any films that contain the 4-letter pattern K-I-N-G anywhere in the title. But I can mix and match where I position these wildcard characters. If I take away the one at the beginning, that will find any film that begins with the word king. If I take away the one at the end and position one at the beginning instead again, then that will find any films whose name ends with the word king. And if I take away the percentage symbols entirely and then type in a specific film name, and I might just expand my runtime here to a slightly longer runtime. In fact, I need to change that to an even longer runtime. There we go, eventually it appears I can find films with a specific name. What if you didn't want your user to have to learn about how to use wildcard characters, however? What if you wanted it to operate so that whatever the user types in is always treated as a contains this piece of text? In order to make that work, we can write an expression in the SQL query to always concatenate the wildcard characters to the beginning and the end of whatever the user has typed in. So to make that work, we can go back to the design view. We can right-click on the film's dataset and choose dataset properties. Just after the like operator, before our parameter, I'd like to write a single quote, a percentage symbol, and another single quote, and then add that to the value of our parameter. I can then click after the title text parameter and add another percentage symbol in a set of single quotes. So no matter what the user types in now, it will always be concatenated with a percentage symbol in front of and at the end. That means we lose the flexibility of typing in different search patterns in our text box, but it does mean that I don't have to worry about learning how to write these different patterns. And if you don't want to teach your user how that works, then that can save them quite a lot of time. So just to prove that, I can type in king all by itself, and then when I hit the enter button, it finds all the films containing the word king. As well as using parameter values to filter the results displayed in the report, you can also simply display the parameter's value in things like text boxes. The reason you may consider doing this is if you wanted to export the results of this report to a different output format. The parameters panel doesn't get included in that export, so the user might not know how these results have been generated. So what we're going to do is head back to the design view. I think we can add a page header to this report to place our parameter values. I'm going to right-click somewhere off the body of the report and choose to add a page header. I can then simply drag the parameter either from the parameters panel or from the parameters folder straight into the report header, and that will generate a text box containing the parameters value. It gives me a placeholder to display the parameter value, and as you may know if you've watched other videos in the series, we can simply wrap some text around that placeholder by clicking into the text box and then just simply typing. So this one, I might add some text, no longer than, and then at the end of the parameter, I can say minutes. I'll just also modify the font of that text box so I can change away from the default font and then back to the default font. And then when I run the report, slightly irritating having to type in values every time, but I can type in hopefully some quick numbers or fail to type in numbers quickly entirely. I do apologize for this. And then 31, 12, 2010, and then the title text, it doesn't really matter. I'll just type in a percentage symbol to return any film title. So the value we've entered there for the maximum runtime is concatenated into that string. And then if we did export the report to a different format, this part would be included. So it's simply a case then of doing the exact same thing for all of your other parameters. You can add multiple parameters to the same text box. So if I drag the start date in, and then I can change the formatting of that before I start typing into it. So just change the font away from and then back to the default. And then I can type in some extra text, released between at start date, and then then I can drag in the end date parameter, as long as I don't get into contact with any other object in the report before I get into contact with the text box I'm interested in. And then I might want to apply the date format to each of these different placeholders. I can select the start date placeholder and format it as a date, and likewise for the end date. And then once again, last time I promise I won't bother doing the title text, but if I type in a runtime and then a start date and an end date, and then the percentage symbol for the text, when I hit enter, I'll see all those values being represented in the report header. You may also want to display the values of your parameters when the values you've entered don't return any results. So if I enter a very short maximum runtime of 2, when I run the report, I simply get an empty table with the headers appearing at the top. We can replace the empty table with a specific no rows message, and again you may remember doing that if you watched a previous video. Just in case you haven't seen that, and to explain how it works, back in the design view I can select my table in the report. I'll drag a rectangle partially around the table to make sure the table x1 object is selected, and then in the properties window I can scroll down to find the no rows section. So there's a no rows message property into which I could just type in a simple bit of text, like no results were found or something like that. But it's more helpful if I concatenate a message by selecting values from the parameters. So to do this I can click on the drop down arrow next to the no rows message and choose expression. And then after the equals operator I can type in some literal text in some double quotes. So no results found. And then when the runtime is, let's say, shorter than, and then I can close the double quotes and then use an ampersand symbol to concatenate the value of my max runtime parameter. So I can head to the parameters category and simply double click max runtime. I can then concatenate some more text after that, so another ampersand and some more double quotes. So that will be the word minutes, so no results found when the runtime is shorter than 2 minutes. And then I could say, and release date between, close the double quotes, and then concatenate the value of the start date parameter. Again, if I wanted to make sure that that start date was formatted so it was nice and readable, then I'd have to pass that value into a function which will apply some formatting to it. I can do this in a variety of ways, and again you may have watched the videos earlier in the series which allow us to do this, but I'm just going to go to the text category of common functions and insert the format function by double clicking on it. I can then go back to my parameters category and double click on the start date, type in a comma, and then in some double quotes I'll type in dd /mm/ and then 4 y's. I can close the double quotes and close the round brackets, and then type in another ampersand and in some more double quotes the word and then another ampersand, and then finally, in fact I'll just copy and paste this, it's the easiest thing to do I think. Copy and paste the entire format function and then just change the name of the parameter that I'm referencing to the end date parameter. Again, I could include the title text in this just by concatenating that in, but I'm happy with what I've done here so far. So I can click OK. Just apply some very basic formatting to the no rows message so it appears in red and then perhaps in bold as well. So just by changing these basic properties in the no rows category. And then if I run the report, I don't have to be too careful about what I type in here because it doesn't really matter. I'm trying to generate no results. So I'll just pick a variety of different values, type in any old text, and when I view the report, it'll tell me there's nothing to be found. So there we go, some basic information about creating simple query parameters and using them to filter the results of your report. Hope you found that one useful. Thanks for watching. See you next time.